Star Wars 7x7 episode 2570. It's time for a Bad Batch briefing. Yes, indeed, episode 12 of season 1 of the Bad Batch is Rescue on Ryloth, and it is a full spoiler briefing, so here we go. Punch it. Hey Rebel Razzer, I'm Alan Voivod, this is Star Wars 7x7, your daily dose of Star Wars joy, and thank you so much for joining me for it. So, Rescue on Ryloth is the second of what appears to be a two-part story. It's pretty much all wrapped up by the time this episode is over, and yet, the seeds of something larger are being planted, and we will talk about that in just a couple of short days. But for today, though, let's sum up the episode and talk about some important points to consider out of it. We left off with the Bad Batch leaving Ryloth, having done their mercenary duty, and we have all of Cham Syndulla's resistance fighters, if you will, in custody, with the exception of Hera and Chopper, who managed to escape at the end of the episode. And our big baddie Vice Admiral Rampart tries to get the Syndullas to suggest where Hera might be, and Eleni has great lines throughout this episode, but one of them is delivered here where she tells him, "I've seen how you treat your allies, I prefer to be your enemy." Beautifully delivered, well done. And the way that the writers and creators of the Bad Batch have depicted the incremental cracking of Hauser over the course of these two episodes is perfectly done, honestly. Very much by degrees, and you can see the steps building. And in this case, he says, oh, let me go find Hera, because he knows, and you can kind of see it on his face, but he's trying to play it cool because it's Rampart, right? That if he finds Hera, at least he'll be able to keep her safe. But if any of the other people looking for Hera find her, they're just going to kill her or, throw her in jail if she's lucky. But you gotta imagine that what's gonna happen to Cham Syndulla and the rest of his family in prison. I mean, it's not gonna be good, especially if they were talking about summary execution last episode without even a trial. And Rampart wanting to turn the screws even further and see every single supporter arrested, and then telling Hauser, well, if people start protesting, then you can arrest them too. I mean, that is, I think, the thing that finally gets Hauser in the right direction, and he tries to get the Syndullas to help him find Hera so he can keep her safe, and they tell him, like, yeah, you were supposed to protect Ryloth. What are you doing? Like, why should we trust you? And that's a fair point, and Hauser takes it. You can tell his pride is hurt, and that seems to be the moment where, everything falls apart for him, because, of course, later on in the episode, when Hunter and Echo infiltrate the building to release them, he ends up helping them by warning them about the trap that Crosshair has set, and directing them to find another way out, and talks about how he is going to try and convince his clone brothers that they are doing the wrong thing. Unfortunately, he does it very publicly in a way that gets himself arrested. It seems like maybe he should have been a little more sly about that, perhaps. But now we've basically got a prisoner exchange. So all the Syndullas and all the resistance fighters are now free to go, and Hauser and a bunch of his sympathizing clones have now been arrested. So one can imagine that the Syndullas are now going to have to figure out how to rescue them. And I'm going a little bit out of order here, but that's okay. The notion of Crosshair reporting to Rampart about the fact that the Bad Batch is on Ryloth, and Rampart's like, we got a whole battalion here, and Crosshair's like, that's not enough. And of course, Crosshair is proven right with all the destruction that happens at the Imperial mining facility, which turns out to be just a distraction. And so once again, Crosshair, having been a member of the Bad Batch, is still thinking on their wavelength. And they haven't quite adjusted for this, because they were going to walk into the same trap. They knew Crosshair was there, so they've got to be second and third guessing their stuff from now on, especially considering the fact that Rampart just gave permission for Crosshair to be singularly focused on hunting down the Bad Batch. So they're going to have to get wise really quick. Oh boy. And the other thing I want to talk about is the burgeoning friendship between Omega and Hera, which is wonderful. And this whole thing starts because Omega gave Hera access to the Bad Batch's comms channel, which, you gave her the comms channel only in emergencies. You can't really trust kids with that sort of thing. But in this case, it was the correct thing to do, and it was used correctly. So that works out great. And we're seeing the Bad Bad Batch drawn into another situation where they are, not necessarily working just as mercenaries, but are doing the quote-unquote right thing at the right time. And even though they are offered payment for their services, Hunter rejects it. So yeah, it's interesting to see how that situation is evolving. It was a great follow through for Omega to point Hera to a shuttle and have her fly around and say, you've always wanted to be a pilot, right? And of course, the fact that Gobi has talked about the fact that Hera has not yet practiced takeoffs and landings, that comes into play here as well, because the takeoff is anything but smooth, right? Crashing into shuttles and flying all around, and Tech says, yeah, your dangerous and uncontrolled maneuvers are really throwing them off, and us too for that matter. So that was well played, like good follow through, and also a great comic opportunity that was cashed in on as well. If I had any particular criticism about the episode, I would say that I feel like the persuasion of the Bad Batch to follow through with the operation was a little bit too easily earned. It was like, oh, you just got to think strategically. Okay, here's a plan. There it works. It's great. I mean, there was really no pushback by Hunter at all, or any of the rest of the Bad Batch, once the plan was presented to him. So I feel like that was a little bit too easily earned. But that being said, this is also a cartoon aimed at younger audiences, so perhaps we don't need to be so critiquey about it, if you will. And as far as other little touches go, I have to say Chopper in action is just a joy, especially when he gets to zap other droids and zap stormtroopers. And sometimes you can tell what they're having him say and sometimes you can't, and I wish it was a little bit more obvious, just slightly, just because I feel like they're probably writing him funny dialogue and translating it in that particular sort of pseudo-binary speak manner. But yeah, that's just personal preference. It's not an actual criticism or anything like that. So just great fun to see him in action and zapping characters. How wonderful it is to see Hera again and to know more about her story. So kudos to Vanessa Marshall for the performance on that as well. And I do love the follow-through moment also with Vice Admiral Rampart, or just Admiral Rampart, looking at the devastation of the Imperial refinery and saying to Crosshair, well, clearly I've underestimated them. So all in all, another solid episode of The Bad Batch. Great action, good humorous moments, great follow-through on the closure of the two-part story arc, and also a lot of legend building, if you will, backstory for the Syndulla family and how they come to oppose the Empire, what gets them back in the fight after, thinking that maybe there can be peace again. And that is going to do it for this episode of the podcast. It just remains for me to say thank you so much for joining me for it as always, and may the Force be with you wherever in the world you may be.
7 is not endorsed or sponsored yet by Lucasfilm Limited, Disney, or 20th Century Fox, and is intended for entertainment and information purposes only. Star Wars, the Star Wars logo, all names and pictures of Star Wars characters, vehicles, and any other Star Wars related items are registered trademarks and/or copyrights of Lucasfilm Limited, or their respective trademark and copyright holders. May the Force be with them. All original content is copyright 2021 by Star Wars 7x7. We hope you love it.